Los Angeles, 1982. Two kings sat across from each other in a recording studio. The California sun streamed through the windows of Westlake Recording Studios, casting long shadows across the mixing console. The room smelled of coffee and creativity. The air hummed with the quiet energy that only exists when genius meets genius. One was 40 years old, the former Beatle who had conquered the world before he turned 25. He had written some of the most beloved songs in human history. He had been screamed at by millions, knighted by a queen, and broken by the loss of his best friend just 2 years earlier. His name was Paul McCartney. The other was 24, the child star who had just released an album called Thriller that would become the best-selling record of all time. He could moonwalk. He could hit notes that seemed impossible. He was reshaping pop music in real time. His name was Michael Jackson. They were about to become friends, and that friendship would end in one of the most painful betrayals in music history. But to understand what happened between these two legends, you need to know something that very few people realize. You need to understand the lesson Paul taught Michael, a lesson that would eventually cost Paul everything. It started innocently enough. Michael Jackson had reached out to Paul with a simple request. He wanted to record a duet. At the time, Paul was still rebuilding his reputation after the brutal end of the Beatles and the death of John Lennon just 2 years earlier. A collaboration with the hottest new star in pop music seemed like exactly what he needed. The first song they recorded together was "The Girl Is Mine," a playful, almost childlike love song where both singers pretended to argue over the same woman. The recording sessions were by all accounts pure joy. Michael would arrive at the studio with his pet llama. Paul would bring Linda and the kids. They would laugh, they would eat vegetarian food together, they would make music. But what happened during those sessions would change everything. Picture this: Michael Jackson, sitting cross-legged on the studio floor asking Paul McCartney questions. Not about music, not about performing, about money. "Paul," Michael said one afternoon, his voice soft and curious, "what's the smartest investment you ever made?" Paul could have said anything. He could have talked about his farm in Scotland, where he and Linda raised sheep and grew vegetables in the cold British rain. He could have mentioned his paintings, his companies, his various business ventures. But Paul McCartney was generous with his knowledge. Perhaps too generous. He told Michael the truth. "Music publishing," Paul said, leaning back in his chair. "That's where the real money is. The songs themselves. If you own the songs, you own everything." Michael listened. He always listened. His dark eyes focused with an intensity that most people mistook for shyness. "Do you own your Beatles songs?" Michael asked. And here is where the story takes its first dark turn. The question hung in the air like smoke. Paul shook his head. No, he didn't own them. The Beatles' catalog had been sold off years ago, caught up in the chaos of the band's breakup and decades of complicated business deals. Those songs, "Yesterday," "Hey Jude," "Let It Be," the songs Paul had written with John, the songs that had changed the world, belonged to someone else. "That must hurt," Michael said quietly. It did. It hurt more than Paul could express. "One day," Michael said with a smile, "I'm going to buy your songs." Paul laughed. He actually laughed. He thought it was a joke, a playful comment from a young friend who admired him. Michael Jackson buying the Beatles catalog? The idea seemed absurd. The friendship deepened. In 1983 they recorded another duet together, "Say Say Say." It became their biggest hit, reaching #1 in 6 countries. The music video featured both of them as con artists selling fake miracle potions to unsuspecting crowds. There was an irony there that neither of them understood yet. During the "Say Say Say" sessions, Paul continued to mentor Michael on the business side of music. He explained how publishing rights worked, how royalties were collected, how songs could appreciate in value over decades, becoming worth more than anyone could imagine. "The songs are like property," Paul told him. "Buy the right catalog, and it's like owning a building in Manhattan. It just keeps going up." Michael nodded. He was taking mental notes, always taking notes. What Paul didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Michael Jackson had already begun making moves. Behind the scenes, away from the studios and the vegetarian dinners and the laughter, Michael was building something. 1984, 1 year after Say 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 topped the charts. 1 year after Michael's Thriller became the biggest album in human history. 1 year after everything seemed perfect. A catalog came up for sale. ATV Music Publishing. It was one of the most valuable music publishing companies in the world, containing over 4,000 songs, including the crown jewels, the Lennon-McCartney songbook, over 250 Beatles songs. The asking price was approximately $40 million. Paul McCartney wanted those songs back desperately. He had dreamed of owning them again for years. The idea of holding the rights to Yesterday, a song that had come to him in a dream, a song he had written alone in a small London flat when he was barely 23. That dream had haunted him. But the complicated truth was that Paul couldn't simply buy them. He and Yoko Ono, John's widow, had discussed making a joint bid. The songs belonged to both of them in spirit. Even if not on paper, a partnership made sense. The discussions dragged on. Negotiations stalled. Neither party could agree on terms. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. What Paul didn't know was that someone else had been watching. Someone who had learned exactly how valuable those songs were. Someone who had been taught by Paul himself. Michael Jackson made his move in August. Working through his lawyers, Michael made an aggressive bid for ATV Music Publishing. He offered $47.5 million, significantly more than any other bidder. The deal was done before Paul even knew it was happening. The phone call came on a Tuesday. Paul was at home in Sussex when his lawyer reached him with the news. Michael Jackson had purchased ATV Music. Michael Jackson now owned the Beatles catalog. Michael Jackson owned Paul's songs. The silence on the line lasted a long time. Imagine spending your youth creating something magical. Imagine sitting in a cramped Liverpool bedroom at 16 years old, working out chord progressions with your best friend. Imagine writing songs on tour buses, in hotel rooms across the world, in Abbey Road Studio 2 where the cigarette smoke hung thick, and the ideas flowed like water. Imagine those songs becoming the soundtrack of a generation. Imagine hearing them played at weddings, at funerals, at moments of profound human connection across every continent on Earth. Now imagine watching helplessly as someone else, not a stranger, not a corporation, but a friend, someone who had eaten dinner at your table, buys the rights to those songs. Your songs, the songs that came from your heart, your memories, your grief, your joy. Every time Yesterday played on the radio, Michael Jackson would earn money. Every time a movie used Let It Be in its soundtrack, Michael Jackson would approve it. Every time Hey Jude was licensed for a commercial for cars or beer, or insurance, Michael Jackson would sign off on it. Every time a cover band in a bar somewhere played Eleanor Rigby, a fraction of a cent would flow to Michael's account. The songs Paul had written about his dead mother, about his struggles with the band, about his love for Linda, about his complicated feelings for John, they belonged to Michael now. Every melody, every lyric, every moment of inspiration that had struck him in the middle of the night. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from being betrayed by someone you trusted. Paul knew that feeling. He had felt it when the Beatles fell apart. He had felt it during the vicious public fights with John in the early 70s. He had felt it when John was taken from the world before they could fully reconcile. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was calculated. I thought we were friends, Paul said in an interview years later, the hurt still visible in his voice. Michael asked me about music publishing. I told him it was valuable. Then he bought my songs. The question that haunted Paul was simple. Had Michael planned this from the beginning? Had those friendly conversations in the studio been reconnaissance? Had the laughter and the vegetarian meals and the shared joy of making music together just been a cover for something else? Some people tried to defend Michael. They pointed out that business was business, that ATV was a publicly available asset, and anyone with the money could have bought it, that Paul himself had failed to secure the catalog when he had the chance. But those defenses missed the point entirely. What wounded Paul wasn't just the loss of the songs, it was the method, it was the silence, it was the fact that Michael never called to give him a heads up, never offered to let Paul match the bid, never treated their friendship as something that mattered more than a business transaction. Paul learned about the purchase the same way the rest of the world did, after it was already done. In the immediate aftermath, There were attempts at reconciliation. Michael's representatives reached out. There were conversations about maybe selling Paul back some of the rights, or working out some kind of arrangement. But the damage was done. The friendship that had produced The Girl Is Mine and Say was over. The easy laughter in the studio would never return. When they crossed paths at industry events in the years that followed, the warmth was gone. There were polite handshakes, professional nods, nothing more. "I think it's dodgy to do things like that," Paul said in one interview. To be someone's friend and then buy the rug from under. Michael, for his part, remained largely silent on the subject. In a rare comment, he suggested that Paul was upset but that it was simply a business decision. He had learned that publishing was valuable. He had acted on that lesson. What he never acknowledged was where he had learned it. The cruelest irony came years later. In 1995, Sony Music entered into a joint venture with Michael Jackson, acquiring half of the ATV catalog. The Beatles' songs were now owned by Sony ATV, with Michael as a partner. The business had become corporate. The personal wound had become a line item on a balance sheet. When Michael died in 2009, his estate retained his share. The songs that Paul had written in his 20s were now controlled by lawyers and accountants managing a dead man's fortune. Then, in 2016, Sony purchased the remaining stake from Michael's estate. The final price, approximately $750 million for Michael's half alone. The catalog that Michael had bought for $47 million was now worth over $1 billion. Paul had been right all along. Music publishing was the smartest investment. The songs only went up in value, and every single dollar of that appreciation, every penny that those melodies generated as they continued to resonate through human culture, went to someone else. Every time Paul heard one of his own songs on the radio, he was reminded of the lesson he had taught and the price he had paid for his generosity. But this story doesn't end there. In 2017, something remarkable happened. Under United States copyright law, songwriters have the right to terminate old copyright transfers after 35 years. It's a complicated legal process, but it allows artists to reclaim ownership of works they had signed away decades earlier. Paul McCartney filed termination notices. Quietly, methodically, he began the slow process of reclaiming his songs. The first batch of early Beatles songs began reverting to Paul by the early 2020s. More would follow. After decades of watching someone else profit from his life's work, Paul was finally getting his songs back. He was 80 years old, but he was patient. He had always been patient. What does this story tell us about Paul McCartney? It tells us about resilience, about a man who lost his mother at 14, lost his band, lost his best friend to violence, lost his wife to cancer, and lost his songs to betrayal, and kept going, kept playing, kept writing, kept fighting. It tells us about trust, about the danger of sharing too much with the wrong person, about how generosity can sometimes be weaponized against you. But perhaps most importantly, it tells us about legacy. Paul McCartney wrote songs that will outlive everyone reading this story. Those songs survived the Beatles' breakup, survived John's murder, survived the business betrayal, survived everything. They remain embedded in human culture, passed from generation to generation. Michael Jackson owned the publishing rights for a few decades, but Paul McCartney owns something that no contract can ever transfer. He owns the fact that he created them. He owns the memory of sitting at a piano as a young man in London, and hearing Yesterday for the first time in his own head, wondering if he had stolen it from somewhere because it seemed too beautiful to be his own. He owns the moment when he dreamed of his dead mother, and woke up with the words that would become Let It Be. He owns every revision, every late-night session where the music came together, every argument with John about a chord change, every breakthrough when a song finally clicked. Nobody can ever buy that. No amount of money can purchase the act of creation itself. In 2023, at the age of 81, Paul McCartney was still touring, still playing to sold-out stadiums around the world, still singing the songs he wrote with John more than half a century ago to audiences who weren't even born when the Beatles existed. And every night somewhere in his 3-hour set, a set that would exhaust performers half his age, he plays Maybe I'm Amazed, the love song he wrote for Linda after the Beatles ended, the song that no one ever took from him because it was his and his alone, written in the depths of his pain, expressing a love so pure that it saved his life. The crowd sings along, Tens of thousands of voices joining, the lights dim to a single spot, and Paul McCartney does what he has always done, what he did as a 15-year-old in Liverpool, what he did at Shea Stadium, what he did at Abbey Road, what he has done for 67 years. He makes music, because in the end, that's the only thing that matters. Not the contracts, not the publishing rights, not the boardrooms and the lawyers and the betrayals, just the music, just the songs, and those will live forever.